All right, this is the second civil rights lecture. This is going to touch on developments that are happening during JFK and his brief period as the president, beginning wins the election in 1960. Takes the oath of office in 61 and is assassinated in November of 63. The first lecture talks primarily about the 50s and Eisenhower, and so we're going to focus on what's going on with Kennedy, and maybe kind of touch about some of the earliest kind of developments going towards the civil rights movement. You can kind of read, oh, it's not moving, there we go. You can kind of read here kind of the trends. We've touched on this about the 1950s, the Cold War, the fear of communism, and understand that part of what's going to happen here is that if we're standing up to communism and how it restricts people's freedom and people's choices and it tells people what to do, it becomes very hard to keep standing up for segregation that limits people and doesn't give them a chance to have a say, and they don't get a chance to vote. And so these are all things that, as you start to look at the bigger context of of communism and the Cold War, this is part of what's going to allow the civil rights movement to develop. Again, remember World War I and World War II brought about changes for Black Americans and other minorities, as is the Cold War, because you can't hold that mirror up all the time. That, hey, we're free, we're democratic, and then not have people that do that. And the middle class is not. You do have an expansion of the middle class for Black Americans, not near to the degree that you have for white Americans. But understand this: you have a level of prosperity for white Americans, and they are beginning to benefit from this economic system. Well, when you have economic security, you're going to pay more attention to things like social injustice. In addition, more people have televisions. And one of the big aspects about the civil rights movement is going to be that televisions bring these images of the boycotts and the protests and the marches and the violence and all this kind of stuff. They bring it into people's living rooms. So people all over the country, people in California, people in North Dakota, people in New York, and even people in Texas, can see what's happening in these other places, and they can either be shocked and say, we can't let that happen anymore, this is wrong, we can't believe this is the United States, and again, this contrast with the Cold War. But you also have people like in Texas that say, okay, we don't want that kind of attention in our country or in our state, so we're going to try to maybe preemptively fix things and smooth things over. And remember that there's a lot of minority groups that will begin to gain momentum in the 1960s. We touched a little bit on some of that as we were building into the Vietnam War. Certainly women are a big part of that, but you're also going to have American Indians and Latinos that are going to start to be very active politically, and even the gay rights movement is going to begin in this period, particularly when you get to the 1970s, really as a result of the fact that the prosperity of the 1950s is not widespread. Well, it is widespread. It's not spread out among various races and ethnicities, right? And so this is going to really be a huge contrast, okay? Again, don't forget television, okay? And so you can kind of see that. The 1960 election, we've already talked about that. I'm not going to revisit that. Again, keep in mind that you have this very close election. We've talked about JFK. Remember that he has this reputation for ushering in this new era, except that when it comes to civil rights, he's actually very cautious and careful. He's not eager to kind of take on a lot of civil rights issues because he's trying to keep support for the economic agenda, for the Cold War, for trying to do the space race and that kind of thing, trying to take this leadership role. And remember, it was a close election, so he's trying to keep this coalition together of people that had voted for him, and so he's afraid that the civil rights issue is going to be too divisive. So understand that this division with this problem with Southern Democrats who are siding with Republicans are going to make it hard make JFK uncomfortable with taking a stand on the civil rights movement. keep in mind that the big thing as far as minority groups with John F. Kennedy is going to be women's rights and how he changes that. And he's trying to fix the economy with a variety of different methods. And so again, like I said, he's trying to keep support. Now, Earl Warren becomes the Supreme Court Justice. You need to recognize his name. The Warren Court, some of you with the ones that did the Brown v. Board video on that case, I had a couple of them that talked about the fact that initially that case was not decided on unanimously, and so and they actually appeal this decision, and it comes back through. And you have this difference from the first time that this case, kind of in the earlier 50s or before 1954, that this case first showed up, when the Supreme Court can't agree on it, to then later when Earl Warren is the Chief Justice, and he's able to create a unanimous Supreme Court on this, okay? And this Warren Court is known as what we call an activist court. Now, activist, that's kind of a loaded term. What you can say about the Warren Court is that they have a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They look at that Ninth Amendment that says that you have more rights than what are enumerated in the Constitution, and they stretch and pull the Constitution so that it covers more and includes more ideas and more people and all this kind of stuff. And so, to say they're activists, some people say they're activists because the things that were accomplished while in the Warren Supreme Court tended to change social conditions. And so they use it as a term activist as though they were somehow doing something outside of their job responsibility. That's not true at all. They were interpreting the Constitution. Yes, they interpret it loosely as opposed to strictly. And those of you who remember me talking about Justice Scalia and how he was a conservative and he was a strict interpretationist. He did not believe you stretched and pulled the Constitution. So this is kind of where that difference comes in, okay? You also see they begin to fight this idea of reapportionment, of basically redrawing lines, because you had these people, you have this movement of the population away from cities into the suburbs in the 1950s. So they kind of encourage states to redraw lines so that there can be a fair say. So truly you can have a say in who your representatives are or who your senators are and that kind of thing. And what this reapportionment, this one man, one vote will do is it will shift some political power to urban areas. And of course people will see that as leading to more minority and liberal kind of decisions and politicians and that kind of thing. One of the interesting ideas behind this is that, now we have a lot of redrawing of lines. We have what they call gerrymandering, where you can have these, and it's basically drawing these lines to kind of represent a particular party. And so that can kind of come under fire, because what we've seen happen in the last, 30 years or 40 years is that they've been redrawing these lines to shift the power into more conservative areas, so that you can have these strong conservative areas. Now you still have strong Democratic areas and more liberal areas. But just understand that the way they draw lines can affect elections. And so the accusation was that the Supreme Court, in trying to uphold that they shouldn't draw lines to support one party or another, it should be based strictly on population. So one man has one vote. There's going to be criticism that the way that gets done isn't always fair. And just understand that this knife cuts both ways, as it always does with the Supreme Court. Sometimes it works to the advantage of one party, and then other times it works to the advantage of a different party. At the end of the day, just know that the Warren Supreme Court strengthens the Fourth Amendment and opens up its interpretation of the Constitution to include other things. And you can see right here, this is a picture of the Warren Court, and a picture of kind of people that would of a sign that people would have been very critical of. The thing is, you can't impeach Earl Warren. He didn't commit treason. So if you remember the Hip Hughes video we watched the other day, it kind of pointed that out. And you might have seen some stuff similar to this after the gay marriage ruling. So understand that we start talking about not just this idea of education, not just this idea of juries, but also the fact that all citizens should be treated equally, regardless of race or regardless of how much money you have. And so the Warren Supreme Court, and not all of this happens under under John F. Kennedy. Some of this kind of extends, I'm talking kind of a big picture, over the course of like the 60s and 70s in particular. You have a number of different things where we have protections for citizens within the legal system, things like a court-appointed attorney, having an access to a lawyer. They can't deny you access to a lawyer. You have that right to remain silent. They have to Mirandize you. They have to tell you your Miranda rights. It's from Miranda v. Arizona. That they can't not keep you informed about what rights you do have. And so you have all these things kind of happening that extend what it means to be a citizen, that extend what we call due process, the way in which a citizen is processed under the law. And so that's absolutely what the Warren Court does. And of course, they continue to uphold the Brown v. Board ruling. And then later they will uphold the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because, again, you have Southerners, you have, areas of the country that want to resist this kind of integration. And part of the problem is by resisting integration, they're also resisting this broader interpretation of what civil rights mean. So there's good and bad with this, right? You couldn't have expanding our rights under the law so that we have access to an attorney without expanding the rights to end segregation. So these things go hand in hand, and it's important that you understand that. Prayer and privacy. The Wisconsin v. Yoder case. This is another one that's on your civil rights notebook. That one is a case that Yoder is actually, I believe, an Amish family, and they did not like the fact that their children were being forced to say a particular kind of prayer. And this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And basically the Supreme Court says that you cannot have a state-mandated prayer. They cannot have a text of a prayer that's read over the loudspeaker or anything like that. And that you cannot read from the Bible and that kind of thing over the loudspeaker. That what students choose to do personally, this is why we have a moment of silence, right? That's perfectly acceptable. But what you cannot do is force people to say things or participate in prayers. Now, there's some nuances to this Wisconsin v. Yoder ruling that we've seen develop over time. Things like where if it's a student-led prayer or if it's a student-led kind of non-denominational prayer, they kind of allow that to some extent. So there's some variations here, but this is the foundation of it because Wisconsin had a required Bible reading and required prayer, and it was an Amish family, which is a sect of Protestantism, and they don't like that. They don't agree with it, and so they're able to push back. And so this is why we have kind of this. It reemphasizes the freedom of religion, and that you can't have government agencies focusing or dictating prayer. They also come out and say that states cannot limit women from birth control because, yes, that was a thing in the 1960s where states could actually say, you can't have birth control even if it's available. And so the state being able to come back, or not the state, the Supreme Court comes back and says, no, women have the right to make that choice. They also come back and they say, no, you cannot, ban interracial marriage because that was banned as well. So you can see that as we begin to expand rights for one area, the rights get expanded in lots of areas. And so this is where we have our modern understanding of what civil liberties are all about. How do we interpret what our freedoms are? What are we allowed to do? What are our rights? This idea of having rights goes back to the Warren Supreme Court, that I have rights that I can claim that are mine as a citizen, and I get to hold on to those. And of course, keep in mind that November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. The Warren Commission, led by, established by Earl Warren, is going to say there's no conspiracy. So this, again, so some of this conspiracy stuff, no. Justice Warren said there was not. And again, his legacy is somewhat mixed. And I've mentioned you have James Meredith in the University of Mississippi in 1962. James Meredith wants to enroll in the University of Mississippi. They have regulations about blacks being able to enter, and you end up having, and they refuse to let him register for classes. And what ends up happening is that he, that Robert Kennedy, who will run for president later on in 1968, he's the attorney general at this point, and he goes to John F. Kennedy and says, look, we can't let this happen. I mean, there's, Sweat v. Painter, right? We have all these reasons why We need to let this person register. And so what ends up happening is that JFK will send federal marshals to escort James Meredith to register for classes. Now, that happens. It doesn't mean there's lots of pictures about how James Meredith was forced to sit outside the class, and it's still not a perfect situation by any stretch of the imagination. But JFK has to really kind of be coached into doing that. When you get to 1963, when we talk about Martin Luther King's, now this is going to be a few years after the Montgomery bus boycotts, you're going to start to see more sit-ins that start to happen organically with like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Congress on Racial Equality is going to step up and kind of organize some things. So by 1963, all of these different groups are beginning to coalesce, and you're having a lot of civil rights attention being focused on the United States. And so these boycotts, these sit-ins, all this kind of stuff, it starts really with the Montgomery bus boycott 56, 57, and continues on into the early 1960s. You start having the Freedom Rides, where they start riding on buses that are going between the states to kind of prove about this segregation on interstate buses. And Kennedy's not sure what to make of all of that. In fact, he frequently keeps asking Martin Luther King, hey, can you back off? I'm trying to get this bill passed and that bill passed, and when you do these things, it makes the Southern Democrats mad, and then they don't want to work with me. So one of the things that he's going to start pushing, he tries to not support civil rights too openly. But what will happen is his brother will kind of push him with the James Meredith situation, and then the violence that's going to happen in Birmingham, Alabama, which we'll talk about here later, and then the I Have a Dream speech that Martin Luther King gives, which we will look at in class. That speech basically is a call out that says, hey, this is what we were trying to accomplish. And it makes JFK really realize that he has to take a stand. So he will actually kind of initiate this idea of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or what becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He says we need a new Civil Rights Act that ends discrimination and all this kind of stuff. And he starts kind of encouraging Congress to do this. And you have this big battle going on in Congress when he gets assassinated, with Southern Democrats having a filibuster where they basically refuse to let the act come for a vote. And you've got all this resistance against the Civil Rights Act and against integration. And then he gets assassinated. So it's into this context where he finally takes a stand in middle of 1963 about civil rights, and then he's assassinated. So he's come out clearly for civil rights. And so what this will allow to happen is that Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, if you remember from I don't think I mentioned it, but on the previous PowerPoint, he's kind of the guy that helps orchestrate the 1957 Civil Rights Act. He will start really he's the vice president, he becomes the president now. He really uses this, and civil rights is very close to his heart, which we'll talk about that some more here in a little bit. We'll go into more detail about LBJ. And he really advocates for the Civil Rights Act. And because of JFK's assassination, it becomes very difficult. The momentum shifts, and people say, we have to pass this because this is what he wanted. And the Southern Democrats, in the face of this assassination, just can't justify standing up against it anymore. So in a lot of ways, his assassination is crucial to the Civil Rights Act of 64 in changing that. And we'll talk about that more here in a little bit. This is the end. The rest of this goes into what we talked about with the Cold War, so I'm going to stop here. And this is the second lecture for the Civil Rights Movement. And you'll be looking for the third one